Okay, so today we are going to learn about Phyla Mollusca, specifically bivalves and univalves, so like snails and shelled organisms. So learning targets for today, explore features of mollusks that allow them to be successful in the greater marine ecosystem, like in relation to like how they reproduce, the like physiological aspects of them and like anatomical processes in their bodies. To differentiate between the different classes and classifications of mollusks and how to differentiate them, and connect the features of mollusks to their ecological niches as seen in their interactions with their environment. Cool. So the questions we're going to be asking are: what classifies something as this phyla? What features does it use for survival? How do they reproduce? And what are their ecological roles? So some key characteristics of Phyla Mollusca. So they are bilaterally symmetrical, so that means they look the same on both sides of their body. If you were to cut them in half, like, they would be identical. So their bodies are soft and unsegmented, which is like one of the key aspects of this phylum. And so then their body is divided into like three regions. There's the head, the visceral mass, and the ventral foot. And the foot is like a really important part of their body. And then there's the mantle, and the mantle is like the outside part, and it is often surrounded by a shell. So moving on, basic anatomy of mollusks. So they are triploblastic, which means their embryos have 3 layers, which is like cool and unique for this phylum. And they have a nervous system that's pretty developed, and it's made of paired ganglia, connectives, and nerves. And then they also have an open circulatory system with a heart and an aorta, which is pretty cool because they're like such small creatures that they can have like pretty developed stuff. So more like anatomical stuff. They have like the hemocoel, which is like their main body cavity. They have a digestive system with like these weird teeth. And then they have gills called, I don't know how to pronounce it, tenidia. But basically they breathe through these gills, and aquatic mollusks like sea snails and oysters and stuff like that, they oxygenate their blood through the gills when they're in water. And then terrestrial mollusks, like normal snails and slugs, they have like a bunch of veins under their mantle cavity, and they absorb air. And it's kind of like a lung, but like a lot more simple. So there are 7 like big classes of mollusks, but I'm just going to be looking at the first and the second, univalvia and bivalvia. And univalvia is also known as gastropods. So univalvia. So some main like key characteristics of this class. Univalvia means one shell or having one piece. Univalves are also called gastropods, like I said before. And so a mollusk with a univalve shell typically has a foot. Like I mentioned earlier, the foot's really important, and the head. And they live inside of their shell, and they can go like in and out of their shell. And univalves can live in water, or they can live terrestrially on land. So some examples are like periwinkles that we learned about. I think that was in the last unit. Snails, abalones, and conches. And then the next class we have bivalves, which means 2 shells, like bi is 2. And so not like dissimilar to the univalves, bivalves generally do not have a head. They only have the body that sits inside of the 2 shells that open up kind of like doors, and they usually only open up for them to eat. Some of them have a really long foot that like digs or attaches itself into the ground as like a base. And bivalves can be found in freshwater or in saltwater. So some examples are scallops, clams, oysters, and mussels. So basic physiology. So I separated the physiology into the separate univalves and bivalves because they're surprisingly different. So univalves creep along on that really big foot that we were talking about. So gastropod literally means stomach foot because most of them have their foot on the same side of their body as their stomach. And then like the mucus or like the snail trails that come out from under snails are like important because they help with locomotion, but they also help them like slide around more easily. Also helps them like stick to the ground, because like we see snails like climbing up walls and stuff like that so that they don't like fall off. They can kind of defy gravity with this mucus. But it also helps them with digestion by carrying food particles through their digestive tract, because univalves, like their mouth is like actually on the bottom of the foot, which is really cool. And then they have the shell, which protects them from predators. Pretty cool. Next, we have bivalves. So bivalves are mostly filter feeders. They strain their food through the water, like we saw with the oysters, like when we were learning about the Million Oyster Project. They're really important for like cleaning water. So bivalves use their gills to capture food as they breathe. And so the food particles stick to the mucus that covers their gills, and the cilia on the gills move the food particles into their mouth. So additionally, they also have that super strong outer like two shells, and these two shells protect the mollusks from predators, but they also help them with camouflage. So reproduction. Sexes are separate, and reproduction is through sexual reproduction. Sometimes mollusks can be hermaphroditic. So slugs and snails both have male and female organs, but they still have to mate in order to fertilize eggs and reproduce. So fertilization can be internal or external. If it's external, then they reproduce by releasing like a bunch of eggs and sperm into the water, and then eventually they get fertilized and then they float up to the top of the water. But also aquatic mollusks can lay eggs and then they hatch into like little larvae, and those are known as veligers. So ecological role of mollusks. So kind of similar when we were learning about like coral reefs, like there's competition between sea mollusks for like kind of like territory. They all need space in order to grow and make like big oyster and mussel reefs. So they're always competing for space on whether it be like the ocean floor, the sea floor, just like in water. They compete with each other. So bivalves, for like predator prey, bivalves are mostly opportunistic feeders, and so there's not a lot of like, they're not very predatory. And then terrestrial or like land univalves and snails are like, can be decomposers, and herbivores. So again, they're not really big top of the food chain predators, but they can be carnivores. And also, mollusks are like the prey of humans technically, because humans will eat them, and also harvest them for like jewelry, like as we see with pearls and things like that. So symbiosis, slugs and snails are decomposers, which shows like the symbiotic relationship between like dead things and like terrestrial univalves. And then there's also this like important symbiotic relationship that I learned about with seagrass and sea mollusks. This symbiotic relationship with the seagrass is like very unique, and it's been studied by like a lot of people. I just thought it was cool that this is like a specific example of a relationship, so I put it in. And then effects on their habitat. So we learned about why oyster reefs are important, because they like filter the water and they help with water quality. But these reefs are also really good because they can be habitats for other marine and like water creatures. And yeah, so these are like two main effects that they can have. So here are some local mollusks. We've got the banana slug, which I'm sure like a lot of people in the Pacific Northwest know about, because there's like that thing where like you lick the banana slug and it makes your tongue swell. I always remember hearing about those. But they're pretty cool. You can tell that it's a banana. Like you can identify it because it's got that bright yellow color with the weird black splotches on it. And it can be found on the west sides of the Cascades and in Umatilla County. And then we've got the glossy pillar, which is like that cool looking snail up in the top center. So those are going to be found all over Oregon. But like around the Pacific Northwest. And there it says that they eat like decaying plant material. That goes back to like that symbiotic relationship between like the dead like matter and that the univalves can have in that relationship. And then we've got Pacific oysters. They're like the big ones that are probably like about the size of your palm. They have that rough exterior. And then the little neck clam, those ones are smaller. Probably, I think they're about like 2 inches in diameter. And they're that like light kind of pink and white color. And then the soft shell clam is in the bottom corner, and those have the really pretty like blue with the orange around the outside. And those are a little bit bigger. And then there's this really cool mollusk that I learned about that does not live in the Pacific Northwest, but I just found it and thought it was really cool, so I put it in. It's the Eastern Emerald Alicia, I don't know, but it's really cool. It can photosynthesize. It takes the chlorophyll cells from the algae that it eats, and it uses it to photosynthesize and make its own food. So on top of like being a like carnivore, and also like eating algae, it can then use it to photosynthesize. I just thought that was really cool. So then this is an endosymbiotic relationship, because they eat the algae, and so that's like obviously like a negative to positive relationship, but then it like takes advantage of it once it's inside its body, so it's endosymbiotic. And then this is the only known mollusk that does that, so it's pretty cool. Anyway, so wrapping up, learning targets, we talked about the different features of mollusks that allow them to be successful, like their shells that protect them, and the foot that they use to get around, and the mucus and the snail trails that help them digest food and move, and how they reproduce, and then differentiate between the different classes, so we can tell univalves and bivalves apart, because univalves have 1 shell and bivalves have 2 shells. And then we connected features of mollusks to their ecological niches as seen in the interactions with their environment. So we saw the symbiotic relationships that they can have with the seagrass and with like decaying plant matter, and also how their reefs can be habitats for other like sea creatures, water creatures, and we also saw how the filter feeders are really good for their environment because they help filter the water and increase water quality. So yeah, univalves, bivalves, pretty cool. See ya later.